to be very clear, like I don't want to be a scholar of imposition, right? Because that is basically the whole colonialist impulse or the Orientalist impulse, as Edward Said talks about. I want to be a scholar of conversation, of dialogue, of humble offering, and say, okay, well, I've learned this. This might be interesting. You don't have to take it, right? I'm not forcing you to take it, but the principles of environmental justice could be really interesting to what's going on in my teacher's community of the Govardhan Eco Village. And they work with villagers and tribal people and help them to kind of settle back into their indigenous place. It's like, some of that is kind of maybe part of the principles of justice. I don't know. It's just like opening up a space for a conversation, but for me, never coming from a space of like, okay, but I have the real stuff here. Like we have to understand and approach people in where they come from their source, like look at their source and respect their source of who they are and their wisdom to be able to have these conversations.
Welcome to That's So Hindu, the podcast brought to you by the Hindu American Foundation. I'm Matt McDermott.
In this episode, I speak with Professor Chris Fici. What sets Chris apart is that he manages to stand balanced authentically in a couple of worlds that don't always, shall we say, play well together. The academy in the world of devoted Hindus, being born a Catholic and then going on to be a monk in the Gaudiya Vaishnav lineage, before embarking to earn a PhD from Union Theological Seminary, known for its strong social justice message. I think we had a fascinating and wide-ranging conversation. Hope you enjoy it too. So thanks so much for doing this. I'm going to jump in with something you posted on Facebook today. It's a quote from Paul Kingsnorth. The very fact that we have a word for nature is evidence that we do not regard ourselves as part of it. Unpack that, because there is so much in that.
Well, I've been reading his work for a little while, and I'm kind of finding myself more and more in his kind of shoes in many different types of ways. Just for those who don't know, Paul Kingsnorth is an English writer, a novelist, and a recovering environmentalist is how he defines himself. And this particular text is called the Dark Mountain Manifesto, which is part of this project that he's been working on for the last 10 years. Basically, he was an activist, fairly prominent from what I understand in the UK, and just kind of reached that wall of ecological grief and decided that what he wanted to do was not save the world, but try to find a smaller patch of place that he could feel some connection to. And kind of in the course of that, he's come to understanding, which is kind of an understanding that many cultures, including Hindu cultures, have known about, continued to known about for thousands of years, is that we're not separate from the natural world. That we've invented this concept of nature because we've built a civilization, European Eurocentric civilization, on top of this idea that we're separated from nature. So just the fact that we say nature implies our disconnection. In fact, I'm trying to teach some of my students at Iona College, where I teach a course, Religion and the Natural World, that really we're not separate. And I think there's so much within Dharmic traditions, within Hindu traditions, which speak to that too, which I'm sharing with my students.
There's so much in that statement to me that it's very hard. It's always been hard for me to try to use English. And I don't really know any other languages that well. I speak some Spanish and French, and I know some traveler's Hindi and enough Sanskrit to get myself into trouble with mantras and stuff, to understand what's going on, but not really at a deep academic level know what's going on. And you also have it, I think, with animal, just the very word animal. It's always humans and then animals. And I've taken to using the phrase non-human animals. But when you do things like that, it feels to me like you're always up on a soapbox, and it gets tiring after a while. But I feel like that's part of the work, that we have to go through or get to for us to remedy our situation in some way.
Yeah, it's very much a disentangling from all of these things that we didn't ask for, but that is what our civilization is built upon. And there's really this, and it's important. I think part of the work I do as a scholar is being part of this movement that is going back to really, I teach as much as I know about indigenous traditions, and I include, of course, Hindu traditions in this, because I've really been learning quite a bit from some Hindu scholars that this category of the indigenous is something that very much belongs to the Dharmic traditions as well. Just that concept of indigenous doesn't just mean Native Americans. That's often how we understand it, but it means and this goes to what Paul Kingsnorth is doing, is being of a place. And this is something Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in her work, Braiding Sweetgrass, about going back to place, going back home. Wendell Berry also talks about this quite a bit. But it's, and like in a sense, like in Robin Wall Kimmerer's work in Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about, okay, well, this category of indigenous, really, it's a life, it's a type of experience, type of consciousness being in place. In fact, really, the goal of this movement that we're undertaking is for all of us to kind of return back to some kind of indigenous understanding, even if it's quite different and quite warped by the past 500 years of colonization and things like that. But still, there's that necessity for us to like be grounded back into place.
So do you think, though, I mean, to play devil's advocate here, that is there an indigenous place that the Christian tradition, to focus on Europe and that strand, is there a place where that is indigenous? Because the common use of the word indigenous, I think I'm getting the sense the way you're using it, the common phrasing, the common use of it is actually different. It's not just native to a place, it's rooted in place. So is there a place that like that Judaism is rooted, that Christianity is rooted? And then and then it just occurred to me, is there a place there where Hinduism is rooted, or can it become rooted outside of a homeland?
Yeah. And these are really compelling questions, I think. And I'm always careful to try to understand the fact that I'm trying to just like share from Robin Wall Kimmerer's perspective about kind of not that like, not that white people should claim indigenous identity, but just kind of the broader concept of it. So to your question, yes, I think like for example, in terms, and I kind of think of indigenous in one sense, like the category itself as being like rooting in place. So this, I don't know if this totally answers your question, but for Catholic students that I teach at Iona College, I try to root, and a good portion of them are pretty earnest Catholics. And I try to root them in the Franciscan tradition and to say, actually, this is kind of the eco-theological place. My colleague, Sarah Jolena Walcott, does a lot of work on this, and she does a lot of work on helping people, especially white-bodied people, to kind of rediscover their ancestries and a lot of the skeletons that are in the closet when you do look at your ancestries, coming from various European backgrounds. She could speak a lot more eloquently to this question. I think even more specifically, some of the questions about where, things that have affected the Abrahamic traditions, where they have emerged from in different places. And I think that that's each kind of person in each community has to look at the roots of where they come from. And that for people who come from European backgrounds, that's a mixture of all kinds of different things. Just know our history and know the place that we came from. I try to, for example, when I teach my students, I just taught a course on the Bhakti movement at DePaul University, which was my first chance to teach a Hinduism themed course. Of course, Bhakti movement is kind of straddles some different boundaries, but it's, and this is the thing I would tell my students, we have to remember this is rooted in India. This comes from the subcontinent of India, culturally, religiously, to the very bone marrow of the people who created this tradition is from that subcontinent. We have to remember that. And I talked a little bit as well, this recent book called White Utopias by Amanda J. Lucia, which she looked at kind of the contemporary Bhakti movement, things like Bhakti Fest, Burning Man, people who practice yoga and basically are Hindu. And I remember I've heard you say this before too, at some of our conversations where, people who are basically Hindu, but don't acknowledge.
They don't know
acknowledge where it comes from.
They're Hindu in practice and belief even, but they just don't even know it.
Yeah. And I'm just always, and again, this is things that I've been learning, a lot of blind spots that I've been seeing in my own journey on this, that we have to be very, very particular when we're teaching things like the Bhakti movement to say, this is from India. This is an Indian religion. This is Hinduism. This is a real thing. It is a tradition, a very special tradition. But of course, as those of us who study Bhakti know she kind of frame Bhakti as this movement presence that moves throughout the world. So she moves very freely and is not always beholden to certain boundaries. I love the quote from the great translator and poet A.K. Ramanujan, who describes bhakti as that which is against ordinary expected loyalties.
That's good.
So she can't be tied down, and surely she can take root all over the world as part of the community that I'm from. The International Society for Krishna Consciousness community is, we have temples all over the place basically, and it's a genuine expansion of the movement, of the tradition. But always, the roots go back so deep and are so profound that I think part of doing that work of rooting back into this indigenous space is just making sure that people know where this came from and who are the voices of this tradition, because that is the thing that I've seen in the academy is one of the fundamental issues: who is speaking and who is being represented, and learning a lot every day.
Let's come back to who gets to speak for Hinduism in the academy. But before we go there, to play off the indigenous part of it. So I'll just put it bluntly. How did a white guy from Michigan first come to become a Hindu monk and now a professor of religion?
Well, okay.
I realize we've gone over this, and this story could last for an entire podcast episode. But what's the nutshell version to put your perspective, in a place for listeners?
Yeah, no, I'd love to tell. I mean, that's also what I was just reading in Paul Kingsnorth, is we've forgotten how to tell stories. Which, I was raised Catholic, Roman Catholic in Detroit, Michigan, just outside of Detroit, this little suburb called Harper Woods. On the east side of the city, and pretty normal Catholic upbringing, nothing dramatic, confirmed, baptized, at least I'm going to heaven, and but when I was at University of Michigan doing my undergrad, I was taking these amazing courses on Hinduism and Buddhism. Donald Lopez is one of the prominent Buddhist scholars in the country, and just like taking courses, and he was telling us all that we were all to be Buddhas one day, and it was just like a beautiful experience. And I wanted to learn how to meditate. So at that time, the members of the ISKCON or Hare Krishna community in Detroit, there were a couple of young men who were monks, and they doing programs on the Michigan campus. And I started to go to their programs and learning the Bhagavad Gita and learning the Hare Krishna mantra meditation. And it was really exactly what I was looking for. And the Bhagavad Gita is that book that never stops talking back to you too. And when you're reading it, and never stops revealing different depths to it. So it was answering a lot of questions I was having, just, seeking kind of truth about reality and spirituality, and, definitely not abandoning my Catholic side as I've come to discover, but just building off of it. And so these two gentlemen, Purusha, who is the husband of Divya, the wonderful owner of Divya's Kitchen. They both own Divya's Kitchen at the Bhakti Center in New York City. If you're looking for good
and just to interject, if listeners of this podcast want to go back into the archives, early in the pandemic, we did two, I believe, episodes, like webinars that are on video and audio that you can go back and find on the That's So Hindu archives.
Yeah, great food. And so he was a monk back then, and he was the one who would spend time with me, was teaching me about the tradition. And it was just very interesting to meet. And he's a white guy like me too. And it was very interesting to meet him kind of in his robes and the sika, the little ponytail hairdo that we have. But, it was very, actually, shouldn't say little ponytail hairdo. It was like very, the kind of sacred wear of the renunciants, which we see kind of across Dharmic traditions. And, it just was so fascinated. And of course, it was a very kind of tumultuous time in my life. As I say, I had a quarter life crisis, which I think is now complementary with the youth these days. And I was really taken with their monastic lifestyle. In a sense, as kind of this idea I think I want to try that out, which is like the strangest idea you could have when you're 22 years old. I graduated from Michigan with a filmmaking degree. So I know my way around a camera and the mise-en-scene, but I never wanted to pursue that professionally. So I had this kind of quarter life crisis and decided, very similar to my favorite Catholic monk, Thomas Merton, getting called in to the monk life. So I decided to become a monk in the ISKCON, the Vaishnav tradition, and spent 5.5 years doing it. Got up at 4 a.m. practically every day of the year, and learned so much. It was just such an immersive experience to see this commitment to meditation, to service. We are known as kind of one of our teachers just once described us as the evangelical Hindus, which I'm not sure if that's most accurate label, but we have a very forward-facing kind of sharing of our culture, and New York City was a place to do it. So that was also very unusual, being a monk on First Avenue in New York City. I just learned so much, did so much service, fed countless vegetarian meals to folks at New York University, Columbia University. We had our vegetarian club there, would teach Bhagavad Gita classes, even printed a little DIY Hare Krishna punk newspaper at one point too, and kind of did it all, and would distribute the newspapers around the East Village. But I just was really, I think I got the bug to want to go back to school. One of the other monks went to Yale Divinity School, and I was just so fascinated with what he was doing. And unfortunately, one of the downsides sometimes of monastic life in the Hare Krishna tradition is you don't get a lot of intellectual. You might be feeling some need for intellectual nourishment. And I was feeling that, and decided to go back to school. Went to Union Theological Seminary in New York City, one of the best divinity schools in the world. I had no idea if they were going to accept a lapsed Catholic Hare Krishna monk, and they did. And then 8 years later, I've just finished my PhD. And the wonderful thing about Union, although I can't claim this for everybody's experience, but for my experience, it was really, they gave me a lot of scope to pursue my identity as a Hindu theologian, as a Vaishnav theologian. They gave me the space to discover that's what I very much am as a scholar. That is very much my seva in this world. My swadharma is to be a scholar, to be a theologian. And of course, a good mixture of Christianity still in there. I'm still going to identify as a Catholic in some ways, culturally, even theologically a little bit sometimes. And just really appreciating, it's just such a blessing to do that doctoral program there. Just the amount, just the people you study with at Union, Cornell West, Dr. James Cone, just the power of the theology that goes through that place. But gave me the frame to understand, who I am as a practitioner through that lens as a scholar can actually be really powerful. Some people say when you start to study it all falls apart. Well, if your faith isn't that strong, it might not happen that way. But just the examples of people, fellow Vaishnav theologians who are really doing the exact kind of, I think, being in the academy and to want to really represent Hinduism, to do it in such a constructive way, and just to really open pathways for understanding is the essential element. There's a lot people have to wrestle through, things I don't have to wrestle through as a scholar that people do to get to that space, but just feeling a commitment to really trying to represent just the originality, the depth of the traditions of Hinduism. And it's a desperate need in so many ways right now in the academic, or for people to be stepping up and doing this work.
Let's go down that path. So how do you see, I realize you're only formally with, you defended your dissertation back at the start of the pandemic, I remember. So you're just, starting down this path of being the full-time scholar professor. What do you see as the issues in terms of who gets to speak for the Hindu tradition within academia today?
I really have been learning quite a lot just in the past year. I want to maybe just shout out a couple of people, especially on social media, these scholars, Indu Vishwanath, Parth Parihar, who I think we both know, learning a lot just in their perspectives in terms of, as I said, there's so many connections between scholars do a lot of work around decolonization, right? And we often place, because decolonization is both many different things. It's a political process. So countries gaining their independence, formal independence, but then there's so many deeper layers to it. And so many scholars, thinking just kind of the line Frantz Fanon to Walter Mignolo, especially recently, who are saying that this decolonization practice has to go to the level of mind and consciousness too. Especially Walter Mignolo talks quite a bit about going back to the indigenous, what is that original wisdom that has preserved cultures and has created very exquisite theologies for centuries and centuries that hasn't totally been snuffed out by colonization. So what are those types of practices to be able to do decolonization? People look at this in Africa and South America. here in America with Native Americans. And I just, what I'm particularly learning now is how to kind of understand those decolonial frames through the history of India, through the religion of India, which is incredibly complicated. And I'm still just like, you have to be just, I'm in a space where I just have to be kind of open eyes, open ears. Certainly not try to impose any kind of misunderstandings I have, which I know is often the tension in the academy, is that someone may study Hinduism or an aspect of Hinduism at a distance. And sometimes that's, and that's part, in a sense, of the scholarly enterprise, is a little bit of critical distance, although I also appreciate people who say that distance is not really possible the way that we try to idealize it. But people can study something about Hinduism from a distance. I've been guilty of this even as a practitioner, where you don't really understand what the original inhabitants of a practice or what the original inhabitants of a particular teaching understood. That I think is the obligation of a scholar of Hinduism, is to try to understand as much as possible the original content of the tradition. That's a tall ask because of just all the crust and residue ongoing of kind of all these colonial mentalities. One example of this, I really appreciated one of my mentors, David Haberman, who teaches at Indiana University as a scholar of Indian religions. He's also a Sri Vaishnav practitioner, and he wrote this really amazing book called Loving Stones, called Making the Impossible Possible in the Worship of Mount Govardhan. This was his latest book. And he just spends a whole chapter on how when these European colonial powers had their kind of most recent encounter with the wisdom of the subcontinent, it very quickly became this imposition that, oh, you're worshiping idols, and this is idolatry, and this is the most primitive form of religion. And basically just put this terrible curse upon understanding of these traditions in their original voices, in their original content. So he does a lot of work in his book about trying to understand. He's looking at the worship of shalagram shilas, which are very much an important part of the Vaishnav tradition. And these are worship of sacred stones, which come from Mount Govardhan, which is near Vrindavan in India. It's very much the understanding these stones, these shilas, are Krishna. So people can worship the stones and they'll adorn them kind of with, as people know, kind of with eyes. And looking at it right now, the cover of his book with eyes and the Vaishnav tilak, and to bring out the kind of presence of Krishna in the stone. And he really does a lot of work to say, we need to understand this not as idolatry. We need to throw off that crust, which is terrible and continues to affect a lot of understandings of Hinduism. And to actually talk to the practitioners. He's such a great example of someone whose research is just going and talking to people who do the worship. Because some people would be surprised how exquisite their theology is. Like their lived theology is something which is, in terms of like ecology, is just, it's like they get it. They get the fact that God is right there in a stone and it doesn't bother them, and they actually express devotion and revolve their own lives. Like that is the exact opposite of a primitive idea. Like that is, to me, like the most advanced eco-theology in the world. So I'm always, again, he's just to your question, just such a great example of someone who goes to the source. And I know, like, going to the source, it can sound very idealistic and very kind of, all of us scholars try not to get into too much of this binary, pure type of stuff. But still, I think that's the obligation we have to do. You have to try to go to the source as much as possible. That requires a lot of historical analysis of how colonization has ruptured the source or obscured the source. But that doesn't mean we have to go to the source as much as we possibly can.
You mentioned you did your PhD at Union Theological Seminary. For people who don't know, is in New York City. It's uptown. It's got a strong social justice leaning. It's very well known for that. If people know the name Cornel West, which was mentioned, you get a sense of that. How do you see, we'll skip over Cornel West and Harvard as a subject. How do you see contemporary Western ideas of social justice intersecting with Hindu ideals and contemporary practice?
This has been such a big question. It was a big part of my dissertation. I don't know. I loved it and the opportunity to talk about it because it's just I very much, I think as a scholar and a public intellectual, you have to be practice your humility, but also, throw your ideas out for people to wrestle with.
I bring it up, because it is a big topic and I like big questions. I tend towards them. My wife accuses me of being entirely theoretical and not practical, which I disagree with, but I'm bringing it up because at least in the public discussion of Hinduism and politics and contemporary life, at least the subset of people that we interact with at HAF, there's a little bit of a tension between Western ideals of social justice and Hinduism. And Hinduism sometimes gets a bad rap. And I think social justice people get a bad rap by some very earnest and well-meaning, or I trust well-meaning Hindus. So I think you stand with a foot in two camps authentically. So how do you do that?
That's a good question. It's at a fundamental level, it's really about trying to understand the resonances between two different realities, but also to respect the differences too. I think is this constant dance that I'm trying to do. So I think about this in terms of I'm trained. So my union training allowed me to become, in a sense, like a participant in the liberation theology tradition, right? Because that's kind of at the core of union's theological approach. It's a broad category.
No. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for listeners that don't know, what's the nutshell? Yeah. What does liberation theology refer to?
It's basically this tradition, kind of emerged out of the Catholic tradition, but from a couple of different places in the late 60s. Father Gustavo Gutierrez, who wrote this book, A Theology of Liberation, talking about how the real purport of the gospel is that Jesus was always with the most poor and the most suffering and the most oppressed. So if through accurately following the gospels and accurately being a Christian, that should be your primary concern, which necessarily also implies understanding in a sense, the political and social conditions why people are in poverty. And he talked a lot about how one must kind of do theology first before you write it. So very much to kind of praxis, how are you ministering to people in the world? He's kind of considered the father of the tradition, at least the one who kind of, as a scholar, kind of codified the grassroots, what the people were realizing. James Cone was my professor at Union Theological Seminary, wrote some of the first books in the category of Black theology in America. Black theology and Black power, Black theology of liberation, and the category of Black theology as we know it came from his work in the late 60s too. And again, always, trying to speak for the voice of the people. What is really, Dr. Cohn always would tell us, if you can't explain your theology to the person on the corner, you're not doing it correctly. So I still identify very much as a Catholic in many ways. The teacher is Thomas Merton, and he was someone who was so committed to, especially later in his life, to justice for Black people in America, justice for Native Americans, meaning he was beginning to get little glimmers of ecological justice too. So I like that, important that concept of justice. And then there's also my Dharma practice as a Vaishnava. So I've been kind of, and for me, it's kind of like just formed in this justice as movement towards action, towards care, not as this thing which is wholly different from Dharma. And of course, I'm certainly not going to offer a one-size-fits-all definition of Dharma because that's impossible, but we understand it as kind of these, in one sense, I would always kind of come back to this sense that it is what binds the universe together is Dharma. And that is certainly all of these, law codes and ethical systems and just the question of how we're in relationship to each other. And hopefully that extends out to relationship to, our creaturely friends too, and all other living beings. So, and you could possibly translate justice in that way too, as kind of a sense of cohesion, a sense of care. There's a lot of these common resonances between the two practices, as it were. If you're justice making or practicing your Dharma, at the core, I think you're participating in some kind of service, very selfless service towards other living beings, to care for them, to contribute to their flourishing, to understand we're all connected together. I think this is kind of fundamental message of Bhakti in the Bhagavad Gita. But also I've learned, and this is kind of an example of blind spots where, I've just been in settings where I've had, fellow colleagues tell us like, justice stuff, really, man, like where are you coming from with that? And there's like a spirit of Like, is this really appropriate to be foregrounding this in discussions of Hinduism? And I've learned to kind of take a step back, not entirely from my feeling that there's a lot of similarities, but then also to say, okay, well, we can think about these common desires we have for justice, what is behind justice, and look for their resonances within Dharmic traditions of Hinduism. I don't, karma might be one example, but karma is very complicated. We tend to simplify karma in so many ways. But just that sense, like I always, as I think an example of this too, I always go back to this is the Chipko women and the way that they hugged the trees and protected the trees in their movement to try to, prevent their ecosystem, their indigenous home from being mined and destroyed. So the Chipko women would basically hug around a tree, get 2 or 3 of them around a tree, and just like, take to the miners, you're going to have to kill us if you want to kill this tree. And it was just this incredible movement that did a lot. Again, there are so many challenges in sustaining movements, but it's for me, it's such a major example of how here's Dharma practice. We're caring so much about these trees, we'd give our lives to them. Again, like that is not some primitive thing. That's the highest theology in the world. But also that's kind of my question is like, okay, but then also could like this frame of justice or climate justice or talking about interspecies justice or rights of nature, like some of these concepts we have, which have come out of like the Western Academy, it's like, how might they fit in this picture? Can they fit? Kind of the first question. And I think always, again, you want to try to respect what the source is saying first and to discover the layers of that. And if there's a way that we can understand the Dharma concepts in and of their own source. And again, this is where, we need to learn the languages, especially that's one of my biggest blind spots around this, but then gaining that, we have to start first with the understanding of what people mean by their practices of Dharma. And then we can see really if we can have a friendly offering of saying, okay, maybe this justice concept might illustrate something about your practice, which you might find interesting, you might find compelling. We have to continue to do that work, but that's to be very clear, like I don't want to be a scholar of imposition, right? Because that is basically the whole colonialist impulse or the Orientalist impulse, as Edward Said talks about. I want to be a scholar of conversation, of dialogue, of humble offering and say, okay, well, I've learned this might be interesting. You don't have to take it, right? I'm not forcing you to take it, but the principles of environmental justice could be really interesting to what's going on in my teacher's community of the Govardhan Eco Village. And they work with villagers and tribal people and help them to kind of settle back into their indigenous place. It's like, some of that is kind of maybe part of the principles of justice. I don't know. It's just like opening up a space for a conversation, but for me, never coming from a space of like, okay, but I have the real stuff here. Like we have to understand and approach people in where they come from, in their source, like look at their source and respect their source of who they are and their wisdom to be able to have these conversations.
So let's take the discussion back downtown, literally, and figuratively, I suppose, down back to the Bhakti Center down in East Village of Manhattan and the Sacred Ecology Forum that I know you're part of. Can you tell people about what's going on with that and what was the inspiration?
So Sacred Ecology Forum is myself and my dear friends, Allegra from Yale, Gopal Patel, we know from Bhumi, and our friend Vineet Chandra, who's the head of the Hindu Religious Life program at Princeton, and one of the kind of doing this great work on Hindu chaplaincy and really trying to establish a base for that in universities in America. We have a common teacher, Radhanath Swami, and he asked us to develop basically a kind of an ecological initiative for the Bhakti Center. Part of the Bhakti Center is developing kind of exploring spaces for social initiatives. And Radhanath Swami has been someone who has really been amplifying the kind of the really beautiful eco-theology of our tradition in many ways for many years. And he's helped to create this Govardhan Eco Village project in Maharashtra, just north of Mumbai. And he asked us to do this, and we've been just kind of developing it for the past few years. really connecting with people through these eco-sanghas, which we've been doing monthly. If you go to sacredecologyforum.org, you can sign up for our mailing list. And right now we're doing these eco-sanghas, which are monthly gatherings in which we talk about, as kind of how Radhanath Swami instructed us to do, is to say, take issues that people are dealing with in relation to our climate emergency and connect them to our tradition, to the Bhakti tradition, to the tradition of the Bhagavat Purana. What does our tradition say in relation to this kind of unprecedented moment of emergency that we're facing? Like, how does it speak not just to people's thoughts about it, but kind of holistically, what are they experiencing? So we do different eco-sanghas, and we, it's a sense, sometimes it can be informative talking about climate change, but oftentimes it's very much like a pastoral conversation that gives us a space to really talk about different feelings, see how this yoga of devotion helps us to really root ourselves back into being good citizens of Earth, and also actions. We try to kind of rotate the eco-sanghas between some more conversation, kind of informative types of things, the particular topic, and then we'll rotate the next month and talk about actions that we can take, because that's something we're really, I feel like the next evolution of the forum is trying to find connections to people really doing the work in the grassroots way. But the unique thing we're offering is the lens of the Bhakti tradition, and by extension, a lot of the ecological wisdom of Hinduism as well, always trying to better represent that space in our various professional work and the work that we do. And to say that to practice Bhakti in such, when you're actually doing it properly, you become very selfless, you become very connected, you become very compassionate. It's not that you float off into the spiritual world, you actually become really rooted back into yourself and to who you are as a soul inhabiting this body, and understanding, relating to people through this practice of devotion, which is not just like mere charity or not mere, even not mere friendship. It's this deep connection, right? When you're devoted to someone or somebody, you want to, like the women of the Chipko movement, you want to practically give your life. That sounds intense, but it's about these deep relational bonds that we have with the divine, with Krishna, that are reflected throughout every aspect of reality, and every aspect, the bonds of relationship that call us to each other as human beings and as planetary beings, all come from that original, as we understand it, that original bond of devotion from Krishna. So there's a lot, and we're trying to figure out, I also do a lot of some other work with the larger ISKCON community in terms of getting temples. We're trying to develop kind of a whole system for Hare Krishna temples to green themselves, and to do more ecologically sustainable or regenerative types of practices. It's hard work, because it's, and I think we both know this just from our kind of common colleagues who work in organizations like Green Faith. Like, it is very difficult at times to get religious communities to sign on to earth care or creation care, to put it into practice. So I think sometimes we're good at talking about the theory of it, to go to what your partner said, the theory of it, and put it into practice is another challenge.
If people want to participate in these meetings that you're having, Sacred Ecology Forum, you're doing them all online now, obviously. I imagine things are...
At the moment, yeah. We had been doing them for some time in the Bhakti Center space down in the East Village. And of course, we've been doing them, we've had a good series of them. And that's just in the last year. Yeah, so they're all online. So basically go to the Sacred Ecology Forum website, sacredecologyforum.org. Sacred Ecology Forum is all one word. And you can sign up for our mailing list, and that's where you find out. We'll send you the link for the eco-sanghas. We do them once a month right now, every Tuesday, and we're just continuing to think about how we really scale up the service that we're doing, because we really believe it's such an important voice. And just the work we do professionally, each in our own lives, we see how people are very receptive to the whole message of Bhakti. Because it's just, I like to think of ecology not just as nature, but the ways that we relate to each other. And Bhakti is, it's both a theology, it's kind of a theology and its own kind of ecology in a way, just even for the sense of how we should relate to each other, which has serious implications for the rest of the world. So we're just really just trying to cultivate ways to help people, give people, as we're trying to figure out our way forward, kind of just groping in the dark right now, what's to come. Those of us who really kind of practice bhakti feel a sense of rooting and care and just a sense of purpose. I think it comes from any serious spiritual practice. So that's what we feel we can kind of, it's a unique lens. We don't, just to amplify the whole lens of bhakti upon everything we're experiencing ecologically right now.
I understand. Facebook tells me I'm apparently a Facebook snooper of your work. You're doing.
Don't believe anything Facebook does. Not my mom.
I won't mention all the sports comments, but I know you're doing something. The Climate Anticipation Project. Tell people about this website, podcast. What's going on?
Yeah, this is just about to gestate. So my research project, I did my dissertation on this concept of anticipatory community, which I first discovered in the work of Larry Rasmussen, who was he's a Christian theologian from the Lutheran tradition. He taught at Union Seminary for many, many years, did his PhD there. I think you can still find his dissertation like somewhere in the library. And he wrote about in his book, Earth Honoring Faith, Religious Ethics in a New Key. And he talks about these anticipatory communities as communities which are kind of reinventing, not reinventing the wheel, but kind of doing what Paul Kingsnorth is giving a good example of this, or people like Wendell Berry, or just anyone who's really rooted in place about creating a sense of community where you can redefine our ethical relations to creation, to kind of retell the stories that we need to retell. And I love this part of his writing. He says to expose the fault lines of modernity. So it has a kind of a prophetic edge to it. Really, and again, I'm careful in my own scholarship around this, never to impose this category of anticipatory community, but I always offer it as a type of frame for people to think about the communal work they're doing right now, especially around the climate emergency, and to say we must anticipate the way forward. This is a human impulse that we're guided to anticipate the way forward by our very DNA. When these particularly intense moments in history in which we have to do it more intensely, it's very important that we create communities that can do that work, which does require, in one sense, a kind of a conscious stepping back from what Thomas Merton would call the mass man reality, or just a step back from the various insanities that we are entangled in, but always, I think, with the intention of building networks of support with each other. I'm hoping this is this next serious phase in our human evolution, is kind of scaling back and creating networks of more resilient, regenerative communities, because I think that's what many of us would like to do and what we need to do. So my project is based on this really essentially, and it's just starting to starting to plant the seeds for this, although but many seeds are sprouting to some of the work I do with Sarah Jolena Wolcott and her Sequoia Salmonbaya Ecotheology project, which is this amazing website she has where she teaches all kinds of classes on history and on ritual and storytelling and really reconnecting to roots. The work I do with Sacred Ecology Forum, the work I do as a Green Faith Fellow, and this is the work I do as a public intellectual, as a scholar as well. The project is, I'm hoping to be I'm trying to not use corporate language. I want to say incubator, no corporate language here. I want it to be I was actually really to participate in what Paul Kingsnorth is writing about as spaces of uncivilization, where he talks to say we have to do we have such immense creative energy. We are literally pouring out creativity at every single moment of the day. We don't realize it. We have to harness this energy to confront, again, Larry Rasmussen says, the fault lines of modernity, which are pretty much revealing themselves every day at this point. And think and confront, especially the idea that we're meant to just keep having progress and economic growth, because that game is coming to a conclusion. So how do we imagine the way forward? We have to do this in a way in which we kind of uncivilize ourselves. It doesn't mean we become I really hope it doesn't become like The Walking Dead.
Which is, I think, the way so many people thought the pandemic was going to go, but no, it's not.
Yeah. I mean, even just like with my partner, I just started to watch Lost. Like I never watched that series, and I keep remarking to her like how they're not eating each other. It's 7 episodes in there.
I mean, it did. I think it came out at the beginning of the pandemic, and this is totally off the subject of Hinduism, but it has to do with civilization and what structures people create when their structures are removed. And it's the original story of Lord of the Flies. Do you know about this? Apparently, yeah. And I encourage people to go look it up. There was a good article in The Guardian probably 9 months ago now. And, the story we're all told is that without the structures, boys are going to turn on each other. And kill each other and turn savage. And the real story is a bunch of kids, Australians, got essentially marooned on an island. I believe, was it shipwrecked or did a plane crash? They got here and they didn't turn on each other. They developed their own structures and helped each other out and actually survived to be rescued. They didn't end up, going in the common usage. They didn't become uncivilized, actually. But to go back to uncivilized, I mean, it's funny to me. It was occurring to me while you were talking that what's the Latin origin of civilization? It's something along the lines of literally just cities, to be citified, to move into that sort of structure. And modern environmentalism, I mean, for listeners that don't know, one of my past lives was writing for treehugger.com, which is an environmental website. And so much of, at least at the time, and still to some degree, modern environmentalism is making sustainability cool. Like you don't have to give up anything. You can move into small spaces and high densities in cities. So when I'm hearing become uncivilized, it's like almost moving away from that. Moving away from those ideas. But I don't know if there's anything actually in that, but it was what was popping in my mind when you were talking about it.
Yeah. But even just, as I've said, this whole horrible ongoing legacy of colonization upon these dharmic traditions and labeling things like idolatry and primitive. And I hate saying the word primitive because it's the language that we use. And should be a slur. Actually, it is. But this, what I think I gained this from Paul Kingsnorth's writings, amongst other writings, but I too, this is especially something in the Vaishnava tradition. So Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada would talk quite a bit about simple living and high thinking, which actually the etymology of that phrase goes back to Wordsworth. I've learned plain living, high thinking. He got it from Gandhi, Swami Prabhupada did. And he was he was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi in quite a number of ways. And in quite a number of ways he wasn't, especially kind of the theology, when it got down to the theology of it. But the kind of idea of Gandhi's the ashram, the village style of life, and I know there's various complications that come with that, but there's something that's very attractive about that. And I'm just trying to remember where I read this recently, where I don't know if Gandhi made a kind of formal proposal to Nehru at the moment of independence to say, actually, let's not develop. Let's return back to this basically like network of anticipatory communities or networks of villages. And then, Nehru made the choice to go in the industrial direction. But so Bhaktivedanta Swami was really inspired by this vision. And this is one of the reasons that we have this kind of ecological emphasis. For the anticipation project, basically what I'm hoping to do is I want to, obviously it's a space to share some of my own work, help me build my career as a scholar, but I'm especially hoping and inviting people to share their writings. This is part of what the Uncivilized Project is, as Paul Kingsnorth frames it. It's kind of not necessarily a formal movement, but just as the space where we can anticipate and create and try to figure out what the hell we were going to do in a way that is quite different from approaching it through like big technological solutions or the market or going to Mars, like Elon Musk seems to want to do. So, what his work helps me to do is to say what we think is civilization is actually not the end of history. It's not this ideal perfection. We talk about civilization versus the primitive. We are very mixed up. And I just keep going back and saying people who labeled people who worship trees and stones as part of the Vaishnava tradition as primitive got it 120% wrong. Like that is actually the most elevated theology. That is what if we're going to build a sense of civilization, that is what we need to build our civilization around, not the sense of like, not basically where we're going. Right? And so part of my project in developing a website, which will be launched in the next couple of weeks, and starting to do some podcast recordings, just kind of simple base, right? Just kind of some good writing, space for creativity, and some interesting conversations. Just trying to create people I feel who are anticipators. They may or may not label themselves that way. That's how I see them. But wanting to just have those conversations, because I just think, and again, just really confirming from reading the Dark Mountain Manifesto Paul Kingsnorth wrote, this is what we have to do. This is the work we have to do. It doesn't mean we have to abandon civilization at the moment, but this is a serious transition going on. And we need to be part. All of us need to continue to be part of that conversation. That is to me what anticipation is. It's just doing the work of getting back to our roots.
One final question here. For other non-Indians who are drawn to Hinduism, do you have any advice on how to engage with the tradition in an authentic, respectful way? Engage with it on its own terms?
I think, for example, I'm thinking the person who comes to mind, the kind of hypothetical person, is the yoga practitioner who is, has a teacher who may or may, be speaking around concepts that you'll find in the Yoga Sutras, right? And talking about just, or drawing upon concepts of like Ayurveda. We really have to kind of guide people. I really want to guide people. If you find something interesting that comes from Hinduism, don't just stop at your yoga teacher. Like really, and also try to push your yoga teacher. And again, there are countless yoga teachers who do this well, and countless who don't. But these concepts, like this is part of a tradition. Like Hinduism is a real thing, right? Like this is where there are times where I've described myself, and I might have described myself to you, Matt, in our conversations over the years, as kind of as an ambiguous Hindu, because it's not what I was raised in. And then in the academy, this is one of the things that it's really should stop. Like Hinduism is real. I know you don't necessarily find the term in the Vedas, and we know all these things and kind of how it has some connections to histories of conquest and whatnot. Nevertheless, it is the way that it is a frame, a very accurate frame, a very truthful frame for how we understand the deep, deep, deep spiritual wisdom of the Indian subcontinent. It is a real thing. It is an ancient tradition. It is super relevant, and it has contained so much wisdom for basically every challenge we're facing today. So if you find something interesting, you want to learn more about what Dharma means, I would say especially, I want to try to amplify the voices of, again, the scholars who are really indigenous in a sense. You want to be talking as much as some white folks like me might know and continue to try to learn about Hinduism. We want to, again, going to the source. And again, that's not to I don't necessarily want to put the burden on Indian folks to explain Hinduism, but Indian people have lived in this tradition in a way that represents that source. So you want to try to guide people to amplify Indian scholars, Indian practitioners, yoga scholars, like people who are doing this work seriously, even if they're not seeking some fancy credentials or whatnot, but are the real experiencers of the tradition. So to try to understand the experiences originally as accurately as possible from people whose ancestry is part of that tradition and who practice it very deeply. I'm still learning. I've been doing this for quite a while as a practitioner, as a scholar, but there's things I learn and unlearn every day. So I might be an okay source for this, but I'm not the best source. And I'm learning, okay, I'm trying to hear the folks who are, this belongs to them. This is where they come from, their ancestries, their histories. They're the carriers of the wisdom, the carriers of Sanatana Dharma, and we need to listen to them. And I know there are no number of complications in terms of politics, history, and it's just, it can feel, it's very difficult. But again, I don't experience difficulties the way that more indigenous scholars do. And all I can do is just try to listen to them and learn from them and try to speak for it, and when I do speak, try to speak from a place of support. So yeah, I just would say it's such a deep tradition, and there's ways that you have to try to push through some of the translations and some of the ways that it's been distorted.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It's how you can help this show get discovered by more listeners. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate.